Welcome back to the Astrology Report, this time for August 7th through August 13th of 2023. My name is Cam White, as you guys should know by now. And this week, I know I'm really bad at always saying like, oh, this week's really crazy or it's not that crazy. I like this week. I really like this time period. I'm actually looking forward to this Mercury retrograde in Virgo that we're going to have. And I think this week we see a lot of significant shifts that happen in terms of the timeline of the Venus retrograde. And now that Mercury is in shadow, getting ready to retrograde. But before we begin, just a reminder for you guys, we are doing another picnic. This time it's going to be a potluck, so make sure you bring something. It's going to be here in Denver on September 3rd, probably at Observatory Park, which is around the DU area. This is where we had it last time, so if you came last time, feel free to come again. I will have more updates for you guys probably next week. My life's a little hectic right now, so I haven't gotten like an official flyer or anything like that. But we are going to do the picnic. So if you're in the Denver area, if you're in Colorado, or if you're in Utah, Arizona, you want to drive up, meet people, hang out. Last year was fun. We just really just hung out. Like, it's not like a boring lecture or anything like that. It's just connecting more with people that are into astrology, making more friends that way, and just having a good time in the park. So if you're interested in that, come through. It's free. It was free last time. Make sure you bring some food or something like that. And I'll be seeing you guys there. So we're starting the week off on Monday with the moon first ingressing into Taurus very early in the morning, and it will be making a sextile to Saturn and making a trine to Mercury. I'm really enjoying these moon and Taurus transits now with everything in Virgo and everything in Taurus. The moon in Taurus is kind of a slow down time. The reason why the moon is exalted in Taurus is, I couldn't actually cite my source on this. I forgot who said this. But the idea is, if the moon like absorbs things, like when it goes through Taurus, it allows it to slow down and actually like enjoy the nutrients, like give it a second to like be grounded and be stable to literally absorb things. So I think as the moon's in Taurus on Monday, it's kind of a slow start. It's kind of a slow roll, nothing bad. But more so like really taking your time, what needs to be accomplished? What do you need to take care of? Also, another way to look at it is, what is there for you to enjoy? What I do like about moon and Taurus transits, it's kind of like good day to go grocery shopping, good day to take care of like the things that you need to take care of that don't rely on like, work or business or anything like that. The moon in Taurus is just saturating the good feelings essentially. And it'll be sextiling Saturn. The Saturn and Pisces transit is so weird. I felt like with Saturn and Aquarius, it was very black and white. It was very clear what Saturn and Aquarius is about. Saturn and Pisces is kind of a shapeshifter. Saturn and Pisces is like, all right, we have discipline, we have responsibilities, you have to be mature. There's a lot of blocks, there's a lot of limitations, but the zodiac sign that it's in is kind of describing what those circumstances are. And with it being Pisces, again, we're talking about the internal, we're talking about the spiritual, we're talking about, again, I just always like to refer to Pisces as the true water sign. Solid, liquid, gas, depends on its environment. Saturn is very cold, so it is a little bit more icy, but you can even look at that as like cold water. So I look at the moon sextiling Saturn as feeling grounded, right? The moon's in Taurus, we're feeling grounded, we're feeling a little bit slow rolling. And it sextiles Saturn where it's like, hey, wherever we need to be more responsible or be more mature, us taking a second to take our time with things and enjoy the slow nature of things, I think assists us in the whole Saturn and Pisces thing. Like, we have to be adaptive to our environment. We have to be adaptive in terms of, how we handle responsibilities. And then after that, the moon makes a trine to Mercury, which again, I'm loving this Mercury and Virgo stuff. But the moon making a trine to Mercury after it sextiles Saturn is Mercury's in Virgo. We have a lot of ideas, communicating very well. We have plans, organizations, whatever houses Mercury rules in your chart, that area of your life is probably doing better. There's a lot more strength here, or at least things are starting to actually get done. And the thing is, the moon, after the moon separates from Saturn and applies to Mercury, it's like, sweet, just taking my time and grounding myself and, kind of prioritizing things is going to allow me to get all the things done that I need to. I talk a lot about just even the whole cleaning your room thing, right? And I know you guys are probably sick of that. I need to come up with better analogies. But when you just handle a couple of things, for example, like you've got 10 billion things on your plate, but if you just handle the laundry, you handle the groceries, you clean some stuff up, it allows so much more free space to get everything else organized. Like the way that I like to get things done is I always have 10 billion things on my plate, right? And there's times where I don't want to do something. And there's times like, for example, if I've got 10 billion things and I'm sitting there and I'm like anxious about what I want to do next, I always go, what do I have the energy for right now? What can I just do right now to stack a win for my day? And I look at this moon in Taurus transit, it's like, it's sextile Saturn, cool, just handle a few things. And the moon trines Mercury, where it's like, now that I've handled X, Y, and Z, now I have more motivation. Now I have more time. Now I have more of a clear path or a clear, a thought process to handle all of the other stuff. So I think it's just about prioritizing and, rather than trying to make a to-do list where it's like the biggest things first, like this is the problem that people have with, prioritizing and making a to-do list is they always put like the first thing is like the biggest thing that you've got to accomplish for the day. And then the next biggest thing. And then it goes down to the tiny stuff. You got to reverse that. You take care of these tiny things first. It will be super easy to do. It will give you the motivation and inspiration because you just stacked a bunch of wins to do the bigger things, to do the harder things. And it clears out all of the space that you need to accomplish the harder thing. Versus if that harder thing is the first thing on your to-do list, it's going to be really easy to avoid it. It's going to be really easy to procrastinate. So I think Monday is just kind of like feeling a little bit grounded, taking things slow at first, and then that energy allowing you to move forward throughout the day. And then we get to Tuesday. The moon is going to make a trine to Mars. It will conjoin Uranus and square Venus. Now, the moon trines Mars pretty early in the morning, but it doesn't make the conjunction to Uranus and square Venus till very later in the day. So I think on Tuesday, as the moon's trining Mars, again, there's kind of more of a motivation there. I think Mars in Virgo is trying to get like too detailed. It's kind of like, when you need to stop doing something. I know I've made a few analogies before when it comes to producing music, but sometimes, when I'm producing something and I'm just like tweaking this and tweaking that and really trying to fix the problem, it's like sometimes you just have to take a break. Sometimes you just have to step away from it. I think on Tuesday, there's a level of like wanting to tweak, wanting to adjust, wanting to fine tune things. And I think it's good. Sorry, I just dropped my pen. And I think it's really, really good. As the moon separates from Mars and then starts to apply to Uranus, I think there's a space there for a breakthrough, right? And I've used this analogy before, like when it comes to producing music, or, you can think of really anything. When you kind of tweak things here and there, it's usually those one little tweaks that like make the song sound completely different. You're like, oh, that's exactly what this needed. And I didn't realize that was there before. And as the moon conjoins Uranus, there's one of two things, either some sort of innovative, solution or a possible breakdown where it's kind of, or a possible instability where it's like you might tweak things and then the song is just kind of like all muddied and sounds like shit. And the reason I kind of think the latter is more like representative is the moon's going to immediately make a square to Venus. Venus is still retrograde. I think by the end of the day on Tuesday, there's a level, there's just you might have to step away for a minute and be like, you know what, I'm going to come back to this with a clear mind. I just need to, when it comes to me doing music, there's times where I get really, really motivated for it. And then there's times where I'm like, okay, I just need to take a break and not listen to any of this stuff and come back to it. Because when I come back to it after a while, I have a much more clear thought process. I have a much more clear head. I can hear things that I didn't hear before. I have different ideas. And I think Tuesday, there's like, at the beginning, there's a lot of energy of, all right, I want to do this, I want to do that. And then I think towards the end of the day, you just have to know when to take a break and to stop. And then we get to Wednesday. And Wednesday is really one of the big days this week. I should really argue the bigger day this week. First, we're going to have the moon ingress into Gemini and make a square to Saturn throughout the day. The square to Saturn doesn't happen till later on in the evening. And I'll put it to you this way. For my caffeine drinkers out there, for the people that use the label of ADHD, Wednesday's going to be a little difficult. If you're all jacked up on caffeine, if you are trying to conquer 10,000 things at once, I think you're going to feel very overwhelmed. Or like, something else that, like, I don't always like using the labels, right? And you guys get that from me by now. I don't think that doesn't mean like, for example, if you like struggle paying attention, or like me, I want to do like 10,000 things. I'm always going a million miles an hour. Like, sure, if you want to use ADHD, that's fine. But the other thing that I think a lot of people like rightfully use is like the overstimulation. This world is, I love stimulation. You're talking to a Venus and Gemini, Mars and Gemini, but it is a lot at times. It can be very overwhelming and it can cause anxiety. It can cause like analysis paralysis. And the reason I'm saying all this is like Wednesday is one of those days where you're just going to be like I've got this to do, I've got that to do, I'm over here, I'm over there, I don't know what to do, and I have all these ideas. Wednesday's very overwhelming. The moon will be in Gemini, right? Where our emotions, our body, much more connected to conversation, connecting with people through communication of some sort, spatting out our ideas, venting our emotions in a much more like gossipy, chatty way. But as the moon squares Saturn, it's kind of like, there's always these memes online that are always like, it's like oversharing. I think as the moon's in Gemini squaring Saturn, there's a level of like, maybe I shouldn't have overshared, or what information should I have a limit on? Something that I've been working on is not necessarily speaking out an opinion that I have until I've like really thought through it. Now, I do my very best to be open-minded and change my opinions and ideas as time goes on, but I don't really like to have a fixed opinion unless I've like really thought about it a lot. And even then, I still am adaptable. And that moon square Saturn is kind of like, you don't want to pipe up about an opinion that you have if you don't really know what you're talking about. And I think, unfortunately, the information, world that we have right now allows us to have all this information, yet still not necessarily like understand or know. And there's goods and bads about it, right? Like we have a lot more surface level education on things, which I think is really great. But then that gives us a false sense of confidence of like, we know exactly what we're talking about. And I just think as the moon's in Gemini squaring Saturn, there's kind of like you just don't know what you don't know, right? If you ever bring up a topic that you're passionate about with someone who might be an expert, they might say something where you go, oh, I didn't know that. I wasn't aware of that. And you can allow yourself to be open-minded about it. And you don't have to beat yourself up of like, stupid. Like I shouldn't have said that. But just allowing that space for new information to come in and realize what blocks you have on understanding something. For example, when I tell people to watch their rising signs, or when I say, Pluto doesn't rule Scorpio. Good Lord, the comments go crazy when I say Pluto doesn't rule Scorpio. And people just want to yap and tell me how wrong I am, and they just don't know what they're talking about. But that's just how it goes, right? The other thing on Wednesday is Venus is going to make a square to Uranus. This is the highlight for the week. One of the three highlights. Venus is retrograde now, and as it squares Uranus, and again, I talked about this like really in depth, not only on my Venus retrograde video, on my monthly overview on my Patreon, and my monthly rising sign horoscopes on Patreon. And the thing is with Venus squaring Uranus is trying something new. Venus is about pleasure and desire and fun, and she's retrograde, where it's a time of like letting go of those pleasures and desires. And it squares Uranus. There's some instability. Like one way I look at this, and I brought this up in I think my Venus retrograde video, is like it has like a relapsing kind of a vibe to it. And if you've ever relapsed before, there's so much like guilt and shame behind it, where you just kind of go like, I don't enjoy this. Like I didn't want to do this, and it's not as fun as I wanted to. And it brings a lot of emotional instability. It brings a lot of, it's just not fun. And so I think on Wednesday, there's kind of a level of like, if you want to say self-sabotage, I don't think that would be the best way to frame it. I think the best way to frame it would be kind of like not having an outlet for desire or pleasure and trying something new or falling back on something old. I think the more positive way to handle it though is, as Venus is retrograde and it squares Uranus, finding pleasure with that. Like this is something I love about Venus and Scorpios. For example, I don't know if I've talked about this. I probably have, but whenever I get clients that have Venus and Scorpio, I almost say the same thing. When you look up Venus and Scorpio placements, it's always like whore, slut, you like BDSM, you're weird. And while there is a truth to those things, every Venus and Scorpio client I've ever had and every person I've ever met has long bouts of celibacy. And think about it. Venus is about pleasure, but she's in her detriment of Scorpio, where she goes without pleasure. Right now, Venus is still going to Venus. Venus is going to have fun no matter what sign she's in. It's just about finding what kind of fun. So, for example, some people can get really into the kinky stuff with sex, but other people have more of a pleasure by going without pleasure. Right. And you can kind of connect the dots with Venus and Scorpio and Venus retrograde, right? It's a time of relinquishing pleasure. It's a time of like releasing all that kind of stuff. And I think as Venus squares Uranus, it's like trying something innovative and new that can bring a sense of fun that isn't exactly pleasurable on the surface. For example, like that could be like taking a cold plunge. Like I personally, I'm super into the biohacking stuff. I fucking hate cold plunges. It is I'm a Leo. I'm a cat. Like I don't like the cold water. I like that shit hot. But that's kind of an idea of like finding pleasure in something that on the surface isn't, and trying something new with it, like not being afraid to innovate. But the other highlight that we have on Wednesday is Mercury's trining Jupiter. I love this transit. And I think the Mercury trining Jupiter, we're going to have 3 of them during this Mercury retrograde. I think this is what makes this Mercury retrograde so good. And I think I said this in my last weekly. But what I've been saying is this Mercury retrograde is a good one, in my opinion. The reason why is like, let's say, and again, I think I might have said this on my last weekly. So, sorry if I'm repeating myself here. But if you have like an online store, or let's say you just have a store in general, your sales go up 300%. Awesome. That is really good. We like that, right? More money. But you don't have the inventory. You don't have the supply chain. You have to, there's more problems, right? More money, more problems kind of a thing that you're going to have to find solutions for. That's how I look at this Mercury retrograde, is like, there's a good thing, but we have to completely redo our infrastructure in order to maintain this good thing. And this kind of comes down to Mercury trining Jupiter. Mercury's in Virgo, right? Communication, logistics, planning, our ideas, our thoughts, we're being very sharp. Things are very black and white. Things are making sense. And it's trining Jupiter. It's like, sometimes in business, people can just have awesome ideas or an awesome product, but they suck at marketing, or they suck at selling, or their infrastructure lacks. It's like, once you just make a couple of fine adjustments, so many more things are open, or so many more possibilities are open to you in business. And I think as Mercury trines Jupiter, this is like, again, Mercury is going to be the more, and I struggle what side of the brain it is. Like left brain is more of the analytical stuff. It's like the left brain part of ourselves is being much more connected to the right side of our brain. Another way to put it is Jupiter being about like philosophy and belief, right? Like our true faith is having an awesome connection to our logical, more rational sides of our minds. So what I love about Mercury trine Jupiter is there's just a fucking connection going on of like, oh, like we're all on a spiritual journey here. And I think, I just got to also really express my gratitude towards you guys about being a little bit more open about my ideas about Christianity and faith. I was kind of expecting more negative stuff. And, if you were negative about it, maybe you didn't comment, but I was nervous about that because I think in the spiritual world, people are so antagonized against Christianity. And don't get me wrong, like I can sit here all day long with you and talk about how bad the church is and how bad the organized religion is. That just doesn't stop me. Like, again, I'm not really involved in a church, but that doesn't really stop me in connecting more to that faith, right? Like I just don't really, I think a lot of institutions are corrupt, and I think that includes the church. But I digress. The reason I even say that is Mercury, or we are all on a spiritual journey here. And there's times in our lives where we're like applying the faith, right? We're on the spiritual journey. And then there's other times where it clicks, where it's like, oh, this is what's supposed to happen. This is how it all makes sense. It's one of those things where, something that I truly, truly live by, like I don't even have a choice at this moment, is like everything happens for a reason. And something that's fun about astrology, and I say fun as like a mental challenge, it gives us this illusion that we're in control of things, and we're so not in control. And so it's kind of like, it's like a steering wheel of a car, and you think that you're driving it, but you're not actually in control of the wheel. Like Jesus took the wheel. That's kind of funny. But there's just times where something just clicks, where you're like, everything does happen for the best. Everything does happen for a reason. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And, there's times in life where, you do something and you question, you're not sure if it's the right thing. And then later on, it ends up being the best thing that ever could have happened to you. And this is what I love about Mercury trining Jupiter, is like, it's the mental connection of like, oh, this is like, it's the connection of our faith and our higher beliefs and our philosophy and our hope, our vision, connecting to the side of our brains that needs rationality. And so Wednesday is a lot. Like there's a part of it that's like you're expressive, you're communicating a lot more, but there's some blocks there. You're trying something innovative and new that's kind of weird, but things just connect. And so why I said it's a little overwhelming for like the ADHD stimulus people is kind of like, it is going to be kind of a lot. I think the challenge on Wednesday is just not being in resistance. Like something I try to preach that it's kind of my practice right now is like traveling the path of least resistance. And that is very hard. Like as a man, as a Leo, like I want to control everything I can. And that's a very hard mental thing for me to let go of. But just traveling the path of least resistance and just letting things happen. There's so much more power in it too. So I just Wednesday's fun. Wednesday is fun. It's overwhelming. It's stimulating. You're trying new things. You're not sure of what the answers are. You're not sure of, what the solutions are, but like things are just clicking for you. Okay. So then we get to Thursday. The moon will then make a square to Mercury and Mars, and then it will sextile Venus. This is what gets difficult about Thursday. You're going to want all the answers and you're not going to know all of them. For example, when you first got into astrology, you were like, I know my sun sign. What's a moon sign? What's a rising? And then you go down the wormhole. And then you're like, there's Regiomontanus houses and whole sign houses. And then what the fuck are the lots? And, what is applying versus separating? And what is, secondary motion versus primary motion? And then you get all overwhelmed because there's all these things that you just don't know. And you're asking all these questions and you get all curious because you're going down the wormhole. That's Thursday. This is for like anything ever, like whether it's music, like when it comes, like whether it's music, whether it's astrology, whether it's whatever like weird interest that you have. There's like a time where you kind of get more into it, and then you like go down the wormhole, and then you're like, I'm just overwhelmed with questions. I have no idea what's next. That's how I think of Thursday. Moon's going to square Mercury, where you've got too many questions and you don't have time for all the answers. Moon's going to square Mars. You're not getting the answers that you want. It's kind of like you don't know the vocabulary, right? Like that's something that I think is hard when you first get into something, is like just not being familiar with the language or the vocabulary. And that's how I look at Thursday. It's just there's a lack of understanding that can be really frustrating because you're going to want the answers then and there, and you're going to be like very curious to get them, but you're not exactly going to get them. And then very, very late into the evening, going into Thursday night, the moon will sextile Venus. I think after all of this, it's kind of like the way I look at it is with astrology. Astrology is a lifelong learning thing. I've been doing it for years now, and there's still stuff that like I'm aware of, but I couldn't sit here and tell you I know exactly how it works. I know exactly how it functions. But what I do is I try to find the thing that's like, okay, rather than trying to find all of the answers all at once, what is the thing I'm most interested in right now? What's the thing that I can gain the most awareness of right now that I have like the mental capacity for? That's how I look at the moon sextiling Venus. It's like, all right, well, I'm not going to get all the answers to everything. So why don't I just look into the fun thing? Why don't I just look into the thing that is piquing my curiosity right now? And then we get to Friday. And on Friday, the moon will make a square to Neptune. And I think just, again, a big part of that is just like, I don't know, like just an overwhelming thought. Like, for example, when you get into astrology, you look at your birth chart and you're like, let me look at my Venus placement. Let me look at my Mercury placement. What the fuck is the 9th house? What the hell is the 3rd house? And then you just kind of get like overwhelmed with the unknown. And I think that's like the moon squaring Neptune. I think the other part about the moon squaring Neptune is, again, there's always a level of like deception. And the problem that I have with deception is that implies ill intent, right? But think of like movies. Now there's a case that you can make that movies have an ill intent behind them when it comes to the deception, but other times it's like to create an effect that does deceive the mind, that makes you think it is something different. And I think just the moon squaring Neptune is there's a level of deception there that may not necessarily be ill intent, but you just don't know what you just don't know. Like I can't think of the only example I can think of is like when people say my Taurus is in Venus, or like my Gemini is in the sun, and it's like you flip that around. You have that a little wrong. But then after the moon squares Neptune, the moon will then ingress into Cancer. I think as the moon ingresses into Cancer, again, we're just focusing on our needs. We're just focusing on being nourished, feeling comfortable, feeling safe. All of that kind of good stuff. And then as we get into Saturday, the moon, while it is in Cancer, will make that trine to Saturn. It'll make that sextile to Jupiter. Loving Saturday for just kind of like prioritizing needs, prioritizing, like again, the moon in Taurus is much more of like, I want to feel grounded and satiated, versus the moon in Cancer is like, I want to feel safe and secure and feel connection. And the moon will trine Saturn, it'll sextile Jupiter, where there is a level of like, again, like safety and comfort. And also I think just there's a level of emotional depth, being able to understand our emotions better. The other part I would look at this as we talk about tomorrow, it's Sunday, is the Venus Cazimi. And I think the moon being in Cancer, making that trine to Saturn and sextiling Jupiter, is we're getting a lot more in tune with our emotions here, a lot more in tune with our bodies. And I think that's an important prelude into Sunday. So on Sunday, the moon will first sextile Mercury and Mars, then it will sextile Uranus, and then it will trine Neptune. So the moon's a little bit all over the place here, but as Mercury and Mars are in Virgo, like for example, you have to think of like triage. Well, maybe triage is a little bit of an extreme version of this, but when it comes to the Virgo stuff, it's like, all right, like what is the order of operations? What do we need to do first? And moon and Cancer is like, we have to, like, for example, like if you're going, if, like, let's say you're wounded somehow, like the first thing you gotta do is clean the wound. Like that's the first thing you've got to do is, so we're not, battling bacteria. We're not battling viruses. Same thing of like, we have to put fluids in you. We gotta do something to like maintain your level of, energy, your level of vitality. And so I think as the moon sextiles Mercury and Mars and Uranus, it's just like, if we want to precisely, go in an order of operations, the first thing usually is always going to be like taking care of basic needs, fluids, what did I just say? Like cleaning, disinfecting, that sort of a thing. But then it'll try Neptune, where here's my, and I know I complain too much about aspects to the outer planets. It's not always, because the outer planet transits are something so much bigger in hindsight, right? Like, I don't think the moon trining Neptune on Sunday is going to be as big of a deal as, for example, the Venus Cazimi. This Venus Cazimi is the halfway point of the retrograde. You guys should know that by now, but if you've watched the video. But this is the interior Cazimi. Now, if you want to go into the very traditional definitions of Cazimi, it's like when a planet being combust, which is when it's really close to the sun, is when it's like a sick or a dying planet, right? And that Cazimi is like the formal death and the formal rebirth of that. And if we're talking about Venus here, and we're talking about pleasure and fun and connection, and there's been this burning, like, achy sickness, Venus Cazimi is like being reborn again, being more in tune with what it is that you want. I've talked a lot about the Venus retrograde being about like changing our desires, changing the way that we want to be seen. And that Venus Cazimi moment is us like fully embodying that. Like, for example, if you've ever quit anything, whether it was like drugs, alcohol, or like even cigarettes, like the best thing I could give you an example for is cigarettes, because they're so addicting. But it's like the first 3 days are fucking hell. You're like, I hate this. Like, I feel like shit. And then there's just a moment like a week later where you're like, why did I ever smoke those? Like, it's like the nicotine's out of your system and you're like, why did I ever smoke those? I feel so much better. I don't even like that anymore. And then you smell them and they smell bad. Like, that's the Venus Cazimi, or like the Venus retrograde is like, all right, I'm quitting something. Like, I'm letting go of this pleasure. And there's this uncomfortability and it's really weird. Then the Venus Cazimi is like, oh, like, I didn't even like that to begin with. Why did I even do that? Like, I feel like I value things completely different now. And I love that. Like, that's powerful. And so again, you got to look at where Venus is retrograding in your chart. You got to look at what houses Venus rules in your chart to understand where this is going to connect to. But this is a formal shift in something, especially in terms of fun and connection and what it is that you want. Like, we can even talk about desire here, but there's a level of like, I don't desire this anymore. I am different. Like, I am new. And now you're just getting your sea legs back. Like, you're not fully like, there's a difference between someone who's like, 30 days sober versus someone who's like 20 years sober. You know what I mean? Like, you're just at that little baby step of like embracing the new. And that's this week, guys. Next week, we have the new moon in Leo. You want to talk about a new moon, new you? It's this new moon in Leo right after the Venus Cazimi. And we have Mars trining Uranus, which I love this Mars trining Uranus. It's really tinkering things and just having breakthrough after breakthrough. Like I said, I'm really enjoying this Mercury retrograde now that I know it's not retrograde, but Mercury's in shadow. But this whole Virgo transit stuff is a lot of fun, in my opinion. There's a lot of good things. So I'll leave you guys off with that. Thank you guys so much for being here. I love and appreciate you guys, and I'll be seeing you next week.